The high country doesn't care about broken hearts. It only cares if your firewood is dry and your powder is kept out of the damp. I'd spent 20 years up here learning to be as cold and hard as the granite I walked on. Then I found her. Half dead in a snowdrift, a valley girl in a place that kills men twice her size. I should have kept walking. But I didn't. And that was the first mistake that saved my life. The wind coming off Coffin Peak didn't howl, it screamed. It carried ice crystals sharp enough to draw blood from an exposed cheek. I kept my head down my chin, tucked into the greasy collar of my buffalo coat, favoring my left knee. The arthritis was chewing at the joint, a dull, grinding fire that told me the blizzard was going to hit long before the sky turned the color of a bruised plum. I was pulling my trapline early. At 58, you learn not to gamble with the Bitterroot Mountains in late November. The game was thinning out, retreating to the valleys, and I should have been doing the same. But the valley meant people. And people meant noise trouble and a dozen different ways to die a slow, miserable death of the soul. Up here, death was honest. It just froze you solid. The third trap was empty. The jaws snapped shut on a piece of frozen pine bark. I cursed, spitting into the snow, watching the dark stain freeze almost instantly. I was about to turn back to make the 2-mile climb to the cabin before the whiteout swallowed the trail when I saw it. It wasn't much, just a lump of grey wool half buried in a drift beneath the root ball of an overturned spruce. At first I thought it was a downed elk calf, maybe a wolf kill the scavengers hadn't finished. I unslung my Sharps rifle, my thumb resting heavy on the hammer, and waded through the waist-deep powder. I nudged the bundle with the toe of my boot. It didn't feel like an elk. It felt like a sack of wet grain. I dropped to my good knee, brushing the snow away with a heavy leather-mittened hand. A face appeared, pale as milk lips tinged blue frost rimming the dark eyelashes. A woman. She wasn't dressed for the high country. A thin woolen coat, a calico dress frozen stiff as sheet iron, and leather boots worn through at the soles. She looked young, maybe 25, but the cold had drawn the skin tight over her cheekbones, giving her the hollow, haunted look of a corpse. "Damn it all to a hell!" I muttered the words snatched away by the wind. I pulled my glove off and pressed 2 calloused fingers to the hollow of her throat. I waited. Nothing. I pressed harder. There. A pulse so faint and slow it was like a failing watch tick. Every cynical instinct I possessed told me to leave her. If I tried to pack her out, the storm would catch us. We'd both end up as spring thaw feed for the grizzlies. She was a stranger, an intruder in my quiet, lonely world. She was already half ghost. But I looked at her hands. They were bare, clutching the lapels of her thin coat in a death grip, the knuckles split and bleeding. She hadn't surrendered. She had fought the cold until her body simply quit. I muttered another curse, louder this time, directed at God the mountain and my own lingering, stupid conscience. I didn't carry her like a groom carries a bride. That's penny dreadful nonsense. I hauled her up like a sack of oats, grunting as the sudden weight strained my bad shoulder. I threw her over my back in a fireman's carry, wrapping her arms around my neck and gripping her knees. She weighed maybe 120 pounds, but dead weight multiplies with every step. The hike back was a 2-hour slice of hell. The blizzard broke over the ridge like a collapsed dam. The snow blinded me. The wind pushed against my chest with physical force. Every step was a negotiation with gravity and my own failing joints. My lungs burned like I was breathing ground glass. By the time the dark, squared silhouette of my cabin materialized through the whiteout, I was shaking from exhaustion, my vision tunneling. I kicked the heavy oak door open, stumbled inside, and let her slide off my back onto the bearskin rug in front of the cold hearth. The cabin was freezing, but it was out of the wind. I didn't stop to rest. I shoved kindling into the cast-iron stove, struck a sulphur match with trembling fingers, and coaxed the flames to life. Once the fire caught, I turned back to the woman. Survival isn't polite. If she thawed in those wet, frozen clothes, the damp would leach the last bit of heat from her core and kill her. I stripped her down with the clinical detachment of a butcher dressing a deer. The stiff wool cracked as I pulled it off. I didn't look at her with a man's eyes. I looked at her as a problem to be solved. Bruises mottled her ribs. Her feet were white, waxy, dangerously close to severe frostbite. I wrapped her tightly in a heavy Hudson Bay blanket, then dragged my own mattress close to the stove and rolled her onto it. I heated stones on the stove, wrapped them in rags, and tucked them at her feet and in her armpits. Then I sat in the rocking chair, poured myself 3 fingers of cheap rye whiskey, and waited for her to either die or wake up. The wind battered the log walls. The stove ticked as the iron expanded. I stared at the slow rise and fall of her chest under the heavy wool, feeling a deep, settling exhaustion that had nothing to do with the physical labor. I had spent 2 decades building a fortress of solitude, and in one afternoon, a dying girl in a calico dress had breached the walls. She didn't wake up the first day or the second. A fever took hold of her, burning so hot I could feel the heat radiating off her skin from a foot away. She tossed and muttered in delirium, speaking in fragmented, panicked bursts. "Don't! The deed is signed. Please, I'll walk." I ignored the words. I didn't want her story. Stories create attachments. I brewed a bitter tea from willow bark and forced it past her cracked lips, drop by drop, using a wooden spoon. When she thrashed, I held her down, pinning her shoulders with one heavy hand, until the fever broke her resistance. On the morning of the 3rd day, the blizzard finally blew itself out. The cabin was filled with the thin grey light of a high mountain winter dawn. I was sitting at the scarred pine table, running an oilcloth over the action of my revolver, when I heard the rustle of the blankets. I didn't look up immediately. I slid the cylinder back into place, locked it, and set the gun down. When I turned, she was watching me. Her eyes were a startling pale grey, the colour of the sky right before it snows. They weren't soft eyes. They were guarded, calculating, taking in the raw timber walls, the hanging traps, the dried meat, curing in the corner, and finally me. I knew what she saw. A big, ugly man with a greying beard, a nose that had been broken 3 times, and a long, jagged scar running from his left ear to his collarbone, a parting gift from a Shoshone hunting knife 15 years ago. I smelled like wood smoke, old leather, and unwashed sweat. "You're in the Bitterroots," I said, my voice grating like a rusted hinge from disuse. "My cabin." She swallowed hard, her throat working. "My clothes." Her voice was a dry rasp. "Frozen solid and useless, hanging by the door. You're wrapped in my blankets. You've been out of your head with fever for 3 days. She pulled the blanket tighter around her neck, sitting up slightly. The effort drained the color from her face, but she didn't lie back down. She looked around again, her gaze settling on the cast-iron stove. "I'm Cora," she said. "Cora Miller. Didn't ask." I replied, standing up. My knee popped loudly in the quiet room. I walked over to the stove, ladled some venison broth into a tin cup, and set it on the edge of the mattress. "Drink that. Slowly. If you puke it up on my rug, you're cleaning it." I expected tears. I expected her to shrink away from my harshness, to demand comfort, or ask 100 frantic questions about how to get back to civilization. Valley women were usually fragile, built for parlors and paved streets, not for the brutal reality of a trapper's shack. Instead, Cora just stared at me for a long moment. She picked up the tin cup, her hands shaking so badly the broth sloshed over the rim, burning her knuckles. She didn't flinch. She brought it to her lips and drank. Over the next week, the silence between us was heavier than the snow outside. The drifts were 6 feet high, completely burying the windows on the north side. We were trapped together in a 12 by 14 room. I threw a pair of my old canvas trousers and a flannel shirt on the bed for her. She rolled up the cuffs and hitched the waist with a piece of twine. She looked ridiculous, swallowed by the fabric, but she moved with purpose. She didn't stay in bed. The moment she could walk without collapsing, she started working. I didn't ask her to. In fact, I told her to sit down and stay out of my way. "I'm not a charity case." She shot back, her voice finding its strength. She had grabbed the cast-iron skillet and was aggressively scrubbing it with sand and water. "You're a nuisance!" I countered, leaning against the doorframe, watching her. "You don't know where anything is, and you're wasting my firewood boiling water you don't need." "Then show me how you want it done, Mr. Boone." She had found an old letter with my name on it. "Because I am not going to sit in that corner like a stray dog waiting for scraps." I grunted, annoyed, but something shifted in my chest. Respect. It's a dangerous thing to give a stranger. She proved her worth. She didn't complain about the cold, the monotonous diet of dried meat and beans, or the lack of a proper privy. When my shoulder seized up badly on a Tuesday, I caught her watching me struggle to chop kindling. Without a word, she came outside, took the heavy splitting maul from my hands, and went to work on the pine rounds. She was clumsy at first, the heavy axe bouncing off the frozen wood, jarring her arms. I stood on the porch smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, waiting for her to give up and cry. She didn't. She adjusted her grip, spread her stance, and swung again. The wood split with a sharp crack. She spent an hour out there, her breath pluming in the freezing air, until she had built a respectable pile. When she came back inside, her face was flushed. Her hands blistered, but her grey eyes held a defiant spark. "You swing like a blind farmer," I said gruffly, handing her a clean rag for her blisters. "But the wood is chopped, isn't it?" she replied, taking the rag. Her fingers brushed mine. They were freezing calloused and surprisingly strong. I pulled my hand back, stepping away. "Don't get comfortable, girl. Soon as the pass clears, I'm taking you down to the valley. You don't belong up here." She looked at the fire, the defiance fading just a fraction, replaced by a shadow I couldn't read. "Maybe there's nothing in the valley I want to go back to. Not my problem," I said, turning my back on her. But as I lay in the dark that night, listening to the rhythmic sound of her breathing from the mattress across the room, I knew it was a lie. The ice around my quiet life was cracking, and I didn't know how to stop the thaw. The second storm didn't roar in. It crept up on us, a slow, heavy snowfall that buried the world in absolute silence. The temperature plummeted. Inside, the cabin became a cocoon of firelight and shadows. We had been snowed in for 3 weeks. The dynamic between us had settled into a choreography of survival. We knew how to move around each other in the small space without colliding. We knew the rhythms of the days. I taught her how to patch moccasins with sinew. She taught me that chicory coffee didn't taste like dirt if you added a pinch of salt to the grounds. It was late evening. The stove was glowing dull red. I was sitting in the rocking chair, a bottle of rye on the floor beside me, trying to ignore the deep, throbbing ache in my knee. Cora was sitting cross-legged on the rug, mending a tear in her heavy woolen coat by the light of a single kerosene lantern. "You never asked," she said quietly, breaking a silence that had lasted for hours. I took a slow pull from my tin cup. "Never asked why I was out there, on the mountain, in November." She didn't look up from her needlework. "Figured it was 2 things. I said, my voice rough. "Either you were running towards something stupid or running away from something worse. Either way, it ends the same up here." She tied off the thread, biting it cleanly with her teeth, and let the coat drop to her lap. She looked up at me, the lantern light catching the sharp angles of her face. She looked healthier now. The hollows in her cheeks had filled out, and her skin had lost that ghostly pallor, replaced by the faint, healthy, ruddy tint of the firelight. "His name is Hayes," she said, her voice stripped of emotion, hollow and flat. "He owns half the cattle in the valley, and the sheriff, too. My father owed him money, a lot of it. When my father died, Hayes came to collect. He didn't want cash." I gripped my cup tighter. The metal dented slightly under my thumb. "He wanted you. He told me we were going to be married. He locked me in my own bedroom to think about my wifely duties." She let out a dry, bitter laugh. "I climbed out the window, stole a horse. The horse broke its leg in the foothills. I walked the rest of the way." She looked at the fire. "I knew I couldn't survive the mountain, but I figured freezing to death belonged to me. Marrying Hayes meant belonging to him. I stared at her. The sheer, terrifying grit of it hit me like a physical blow. She had chosen a clean, agonizing death in the snow over a lifetime of submission. I had spent my life running from the world because I found it disappointing. She had run from it because it was a cage. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. I grabbed the bottle of whiskey, pouring another harsh measure into my cup. I was angry. Angry at this man Hayes, angry at the world down below, but mostly angry at myself for caring. "You're a damn fool," I growled, pacing the short distance between the table and the window. "You think you're safe here. You think a few weeks in a cabin makes you a mountain woman. When the thaw comes, he'll send men looking. And if they find you here..." "They won't look this high," she said calmly. "You don't know men like that!" I snapped, turning on her. The volume of my own voice startled me. Men like that don't let things go. They treat people like property. And I ain't a Sheriff Cora. I'm an old man with bad joints and a rusty rifle. She stood up slowly, leaving the coat on the floor. She walked toward me. I tensed my instinct to step back, warring with the sudden, terrifying proximity of her. "You're not an old man, Jed," she said softly. It was the first time she had used my given name. It sounded strange, foreign, and dangerously warm on her lips. "I'm 58 years old, Cora," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I pointed to the jagged scar on my neck, the deep lines around my eyes. "Look at me. I'm scarred up, broken down, and half blind in my left eye. I smell like dirt and pine pitch. I ain't got a future, just a past that I'm trying to forget." She stopped a foot away from me. She had to tilt her head up to look into my eyes. I swallowed hard, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "You're too young for an old mountain man." The silence stretched thick and suffocating. I expected her to agree, to step back to realize the absurdity of the tension pulling tight between us. I braced myself for the rejection of familiar, cold comfort. Instead, Cora lifted her hand. Her fingers calloused from chopping. My wood burned from my hot skillet, reached up and gently touched the rough, scarred skin of my cheek. I flinched, my breath hitching in my chest, but her hand was steady, grounding me. She didn't look at the scars. She looked right through them into the dark, hidden center of me that I had kept buried under ice and isolation for 20 years. And she whispered, "To me, you're perfect." The cynical armor I wore, the tough, bitter hide of Jedediah Boone, fractured completely. I didn't think about Hayes. I didn't think about the snow outside or my bad knee or the years separating us. I looked down at the fierce, beautiful, broken woman who had dragged herself into my life, and for the first time in 2 decades I felt entirely alive. Morning didn't come with a choir of birds or shafts of golden sunlight. It came with the bitter ache of cold seeping through the floorboards and the dull throb in my bad knee. I was in the rocking chair, a stiff woolen blanket draped over my shoulders. The fire had burned down to grey ash and a few stubborn orange coals. I hadn't slept. My mind had spent the night turning over a single impossible moment. "To me, you're perfect." I rubbed a hand over my face, feeling the rough grit of my beard and the slick, hard ridge of the scar tissue on my cheek. I was a fool. A lonely, aging fool who had let a few weeks of shared oxygen and a soft look scramble his brains. Cora was 25, beautiful, in a sharp, hungry way, and running on the high-octane adrenaline of sheer survival. What she felt wasn't love. It was gratitude. It was the desperate attachment of a drowning woman clinging to a piece of driftwood. When she woke, she would realize it. The daylight would show her the dirt beneath my fingernails, the grey in my hair, the cramped, squalid reality of a trapper's shack. I threw off the blanket and went to the stove. I made noise deliberately. The iron door clanged. The kindling cracked. I wanted the normal, harsh sounds of my life to drown out the lingering softness of last night. I heard the rustle of the mattress behind me. I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the coffee pot, watching the black water begin to boil. You sleep in that chair." Her voice was thick with sleep, scratchy and low. "I've slept on worse?" I said, my tone flatter than I intended. I poured a tin cup of the bitter brew and set it on the table. "Drink that. We need to inventory the dried meat today. The salt pork is running low." Silence stretched behind me. The heavy, expectant kind. I finally turned. She was sitting on the edge of the mattress, the oversized canvas trousers rolled at the ankles, my old flannel shirt hanging off her shoulders. Her hair was a tangled, dark mess. She wasn't looking at the coffee. She was looking at me, her pale grey eyes narrowed, calculating. She stood up, ignoring the cup, and closed the distance between us. She didn't stop until she was a foot away, forcing me to look down at her. "I remember what I said last night, Jed," she said quietly. Her voice had no tremor in it. "I don't take back words." I broke her gaze, looking out the frosted window. "You're confused, Cora. You're scared and you're alive and you're mixing up the two. You don't want an old man who smells like pine tar and blood. You want a ticket out of here. Don't tell me what I want." The sharpness in her tone snapped my attention back to her. My whole life men have told me what I want. My father told me I wanted a wealthy husband to secure his debts. Hayes told me I wanted to be a lady of a grand estate. Now you're telling me I want a ticket out. She stepped closer. The smell of her wood smoke strong lye soap, and something uniquely fiercely hers, cut through the stale air of the cabin. "I didn't climb this mountain looking for a savior," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "I climbed it looking for a place where I belonged to myself. And I found a man who let me chop my own wood, who handed me a hammer instead of a handkerchief. You didn't try to own me, Jed. You just let me live." She reached out her hand, resting flat against my chest. I could feel the heat of her palm through my heavy shirt. "You think your scars make you ugly," she continued, her thumb brushing the collar of my shirt. "Down in the valley, men hide their ugliness on the inside. They wear silk vests and smell like bay rum, and they lock women in rooms. Your scars are right out where I can see them. They're honest. I like honest." I swallowed hard. The cynical protective shell I had built around myself was cracking, the pieces falling away, leaving me exposed and terrified. I raised my hands thick and calloused and gently grasped her waist. She felt fragile beneath the heavy canvas, but I knew she was forged of iron. "I don't have anything to give you, Cora," I murmured, my voice thick. "No money, no soft life, just a cabin that leaks in the spring and freezes in the winter." She tilted her head up, her eyes bright and defiant. "Then we'll patch the roof." I didn't pull away this time. I lowered my head, and when our lips met, it wasn't tentative. It was a collision of desperate, lonely years meeting undeniable, stubborn warmth. She tasted like chicory coffee and salt, her hands wrapping tight in the fabric of my shirt, anchoring herself to me. It wasn't a romance novel kiss. Our noses bumped. My beard scratched her chin. It was clumsy, real, and entirely perfect. For the next 2 weeks, the cabin felt different. The stifling walls seemed to expand. The silence wasn't a void to be filled. It was a shared space. We didn't talk much about the future. We focused on the present. I taught her how to strip and clean the heavy .44-40 Winchester. She taught me how to properly render deer fat so the cabin didn't smell like rancid meat. We were building a life in the margins of the world. Then the weather broke. It started as a subtle shift in the air pressure, a heavy dampness that made my joints ache with a new intensity. The wind stopped howling and started to moan. And then the sound began. Drip, drip, drip. It was the sound of melting snow sliding off the eaves and hitting the ice pack below. It was a sound I usually welcomed. It meant the earth was waking up. But as I stood on the porch, smoking a rolled cigarette and watching the icicles shrink on the roofline, the sound didn't bring relief. It sounded like a ticking clock. The snowpack on the pass was turning to slush. The lower trails were turning to mud. The mountain was unlocking its doors. Cora stepped onto the porch behind me, wrapping her arms around my waist, pressing her cheek against my back. "It's warming up." "Yeah," I grunted, flicking the cigarette ash into the snow. "Mud season's coming." "You sound worried." I turned, pulling her against my side, looking down the long, steep slope of the mountain toward the hidden valley miles below. The white blanket was starting to show patches of dark, jagged rock. The snow kept us a secret, Cora. I said, the cold truth settling heavy in my gut. When the thaw finishes, the secret's out. Hayes won't have stopped looking. He's just been waiting for the ice to melt. By late April, the Bitterroots were a treacherous mess of rushing runoff and deep-sucking mud. The creeks were swollen, roaring like freight trains over the granite boulders. The air smelled of wet pine needles decay and the sharp, clean scent of new growth. I was 4 miles down from the cabin checking a ridgeline where the mule deer usually bedded down during the spring transition. Meat was getting scarce, and the salted pork was long gone. I moved silently, a ghost in grease-darkened buckskins and wool my Sharps rifle cradled in the crook of my arm. I found the tracks near a stand of paper birch. I dropped to a crouch, my bad knee screaming in protest, and brushed a fallen wet leaf away. A hoof print, deep, sharply defined in the soft mud, and shod. Mountain men didn't ride horses up here this early in the season. The footing was too dangerous, the risk of a broken leg too high. Only fools or men being paid a hell of a lot of money forced animals up this steep grade in April. I moved forward, tracking the sign. There were 2 horses. Beside the prints I found a pile of horse dung still steaming faintly in the cool air, and a few yards away the distinct, heavy imprint of a man's boot with a spurred heel. They were climbing, heading toward the high basin, heading toward my valley. A cold, familiar focus washed over me. It was the instinct that had kept me alive through Indian skirmishes and grisly charges. I stopped being a man thinking about a woman in a cabin. I became the apex predator of my own territory. I abandoned the deer trail and began a brutal vertical climb, cutting switchbacks to get ahead of them. My lungs burned, drawing in the thin air, and sweat soaked my thermal shirt, but I didn't stop. I knew this terrain intimately. Every ravine, every deadfall, every patch of unstable shale. They were following the creek line, taking the path of least resistance. That was their first mistake. I reached a rocky outcropping that hung 30 feet above the creek. I lay flat on my stomach on the wet stone, pushing the heavy octagonal barrel of the Sharps through a cluster of stunted juniper bushes. I pulled the hammer back to half cock, opened the breech, and slid a heavy brass .50-90 cartridge into the chamber. I closed the action with a soft metallic click that was instantly swallowed by the roar of the water below. I waited. The damp seeped through my clothes, chilling me to the bone, but my hands were rock steady. 20 minutes later they appeared. 2 men leading their exhausted horses on foot through the thick muck along the bank. They looked miserable. Mud coated their leather dusters to the waist. One was a thick-set man with a dark, overgrown beard. The other was younger, wiry, carrying a lever-action rifle over his shoulder like a farm implement. They weren't trackers. They were muscle. City toughs sent to do a mountain man's job. "Tell me again why we're climbing this god-forsaken rock, Cole," the younger one complained, his voice carrying over the rushing water. He kicked a stone into the creek. "Because Mr. Hayes pays us $10 a day, kid." The bearded man Cole grunted, and he says the girl's horse was found at the base of this ridge. She didn't walk to Spokane. She either died in a drift or someone took her in. We find a body or we find a cabin. Either way, we get a bonus. "She's dead, Cole. Nobody lives up here but bears and lunatics." "Then we'll shoot the lunatics and take their pelts." Cole sneered. They paused directly below my outcropping to let the horses drink. Cole pulled a canteen from his saddlebag. I didn't give a warning. Warnings were for civilized men in dusty streets facing each other at high noon. Up here, survival meant striking first and striking hard. I laid the iron sights on the center of Cole's chest. I let out half a breath and squeezed the heavy trigger. The Sharps went off with a concussive boom that shook the dust from the rocks. The recoil punched my bad shoulder, but the heavy lead slug flew true. It caught Cole dead center, picking him up off his feet and throwing him backward into the rushing creek. The water turned a violent, swirling pink around him. He didn't even scream. The horses panicked, rearing and screaming, snapping their reins, and bolting back down the trail. The younger kid froze for a fraction of a second, his eyes wide with shock, looking at the water where Cole had vanished. Then instinct took over. He dropped behind a mossy boulder, levering around into his rifle. "Where are you, you son of a bitch?" He screamed, his voice cracking with terror. He fired a blind shot toward the opposite ridge, completely misjudging where the sound had come from. I didn't reload the sharps. It took too long. I laid the rifle gently on the stone and drew the heavy Colt revolver from my hip. I slid backward off the outcropping, dropping into the dense brush, and began to flank him. I moved with agonizing slowness, heel to toe, placing my weight only on solid ground, avoiding dry twigs and brittle leaves. I circled around the back of the boulder where he was hiding. I could hear his panicked, ragged breathing. I stepped out from the brush, 10 feet away from him. He was facing the creek, his rifle raised, trembling violently. "Drop it," I said. My voice was low, carrying no emotion, just dead weight. He spun around, letting out a startled yelp, bringing the rifle barrel toward me. I fired once. The heavy point, .45 caliber bullet struck his right shoulder, shattering the collarbone. The rifle flew from his hands as he spun and collapsed into the mud, screaming in agony, clutching his ruined arm. I walked over to him, my boots squelching in the muck. I kicked his fallen rifle away. He was thrashing his face pale, weeping openly. "Please," he gasped, staring up at the bore of my revolver. "Please, mister. I was just hired on. I didn't know." "You knew you were looking for a girl," I said coldly. "You knew what Hayes would do to her. I ain't got no quarrel with you. You crossed into my valley," I said. "You brought a quarrel." I thumbed the hammer back. The mechanical click sounded loud in the sudden quiet of the woods. He squeezed his eyes shut, sobbing. I looked at him. A miserable, bleeding kid, dying in the mud for $10 a day. 10 years ago, I would have pulled the trigger and gone home to sleep without a second thought. But Cora's face flashed in my mind. "Your scars are honest. I like honest. If I executed him while he lay there crying, the scar on my soul would be something I couldn't hide from her." I slowly lowered the hammer. "Wrap that arm," I snarled, stepping back. "Walk down this mountain. If you stop to rest, you die. If you tell Hayes you found someone, I will come down to that valley, I will find you, and I will finish what I started. You tell him you searched the high pass and found nothing but ice. Do you understand me?" He nodded frantically, his face grey with shock and blood loss. Yes, sir. Get walking." I watched him stumble to his feet and begin the agonizing trek down the mountain. I knew I was making a mistake. I was leaving an edge dull, a threat alive. But I holstered my gun. I was trying to be a man a woman could look at without flinching. I went to the creek, dragged Cole's heavy body out of the water, and stripped him of his ammunition, his matches, and a good hunting knife. I left the body in the brush. The wolves would find it before nightfall. I wiped the blood from my hands with wet moss, picked up my sharps, and started the long climb home. The quiet of the mountain had been broken. Blood was in the meltwater. The smell of blood is metallic and sharp, like a handful of old copper pennies clutched in a sweaty palm. It was entirely on my clothes, soaked into the right sleeve of my coat, where I had braced Cole's heavy body against my hip to drag him. I pushed the cabin door open with my left hand. Cora was at the stove, stirring a pot of beans. She turned a smile, touching the corners of her mouth, ready to say something. The words died in her throat. Her eyes dropped to my sleeve, to the dark, wet stain spreading across the wool, then to the grim, hollow look on my face. She didn't scream. She didn't drop the wooden spoon. She set it carefully on the edge of the stove, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked over to me. "Are you hit?" she asked. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. "No," I said, leaning my rifle against the wall. The adrenaline was leaving my system, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. "It ain't mine." "Sit," she ordered, pointing to the chair. I sat heavily. She unbuttoned my coat, peeling the blood-soaked wool off my shoulders. She tossed it onto the floorboards in the corner. She inspected my flannel shirt, found a small tear near my bicep, where a sharp branch had caught me in the brush, but no bullet holes. She brought a basin of warm water and a rag. She knelt beside the chair and began wiping the dried mud and faint smears of blood from my hands. Her touch was gentle, but her jaw was set tight. "Who were they?" she asked, not looking up from my hands. "Two men," I replied, staring at the top of her dark hair. "Riding shod horses up the creek bed. They were tracking your stolen horse, looking for a body or a cabin." Her hands paused for a fraction of a second. Then she resumed scrubbing. "You killed them?" It wasn't a question, but I answered anyway. "One, a thick-bearded man named Cole. I dropped him by the creek. The other was a kid. I shot him in the shoulder. I let him walk back down." Cora stopped washing. She dropped the rag into the pink-tinged water and looked up at me. Her pale grey eyes were wide, a mix of fear and an intellect working at furious speed. "Cole," she whispered. "Elias Cole. He's Hayes's foreman. He runs the Rough Riders for the ranch." I closed my eyes, letting my head rest against the back of the chair. I should have killed the kid. "Yes." Cora said, her voice hard as flint. "You should have, because that kid is going to walk into the valley bleeding and terrified, and he's going to tell Hayes exactly where he got shot." I told him to lie. Men lie to save their own skin, Jed. But when Hayes puts a hot iron to that kid's good arm, he'll sing like a church choir. He'll tell them about the mountain man with the heavy rifle. She stood up, pacing the small room, her arms crossed tight over her chest. The domestic peace of the morning was shattered, replaced by the suffocating reality of impending violence. "We have to run," she said, stopping by the window to look out at the darkening tree line. "We pack what we can carry. Head north over the ridge. There's a mining town 50 miles up, a train station. We can disappear." "Cora," I said softly, opening my eyes. "The North Ridge is still under 4 feet of pack ice. We try to cross that on foot carrying supplies. We'll die of exposure before we make 20 miles. We'd be trapped in the open." She spun around, her eyes flashing. "So we stay here. We sit in this wooden box and wait for Hayes to send 20 men with repeating rifles. Jed, they will burn this cabin to the ground with us inside it." "I know." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, staring at my clean, wet hands. "I've spent 20 years learning the choke points of this valley. I know where the rock slides are. I know where the trails narrow so tight a horse has to walk single file. I can hold them off." "You're one man!" she shouted, her composure finally cracking. Tears of pure frustration welled in her eyes. "You are one man with a bad knee and grey hair. You're not invincible." I stood up slowly, crossing the room to stand in front of her. I didn't reach for her. I just looked down into her fierce, terrified face. "I'm not invincible." I agreed, my voice a low rumble in my chest. "But I am defending my home, and I am defending you. A man fights different when he has a reason to stay alive. For 20 years, I didn't care if I woke up the next morning. Now I do." Cora stared at me, a tear breaking free and cutting a clean line down her dusty cheek. She wiped it away angrily with the back of her hand. She looked around the cabin at the iron stove, the hanging traps, the patched roof, the heavy oak door. She was looking at the only place she had ever truly felt safe. She took a deep, shuddering breath. The panic drained out of her face, replaced by a cold, terrifying resolve. She walked over to the corner, picked up my heavy coat from the floor, and threw it over a chair. Then she walked to the gun rack. She reached up and lifted the heavy 44-40 Winchester lever-action rifle from its wooden pegs. She turned back to me, the rifle held awkwardly but securely in her hands. "The pass is narrow at the Devil's Chimney," she said, her voice steady. "They'll have to dismount to lead the horses through the rocks." I stared at her, shock rippling through me. "Cora, show me how to load the magazine fast," she interrupted, stepping towards the table and laying the rifle down flat. She pulled up a chair and sat. She looked up at me, her pale eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that burned. "Show me how to account for bullet drop at 100 yards. You said I swung an axe like a blind farmer. Make sure I don't shoot like one." "You don't have to do this," I said heavily, moving to stand beside her. "You don't have to take lives. Hayes took my father. He took my freedom. He sent men to drag me back to a cage." She picked up a brass cartridge from the table, turning it over in her fingers. "I'm not a valley girl anymore, Jed. I belong to the mountain now, and we protect what's ours." I looked at the woman sitting at my table. She wasn't hiding behind me. She was standing beside me. I reached down, placing my large, scarred hand over hers, pressing the cold brass cartridge into her palm. "All right," I whispered. "We make our stand." The thaw had come, and hell was marching up the mountain. But as I looked at Cora, I knew we would meet it with fire. The Devil's Chimney wasn't a place you went by accident. It was a narrow, jagged fault line in the granite face of the upper mountain, a natural choke point, where the old game trail squeezed between two sheer walls of black rock. To get through, a man had to dismount to walk single file, and pray the shale under his boots didn't give way. We got there an hour before dawn. The sky was the color of a bruised thumbnail, heavy and purple. I set Cora up in a cluster of jagged boulders overlooking the exit of the chimney. It gave her a clear downward angle, protected by solid rock on 3 sides. I piled loose stones around the gaps. "When the shooting starts, you don't stand up," I told her, my voice barely audible over the wind whistling through the rocks. I guided her hands as she laid the heavy barrel of the Winchester across a flat stone. "You lever the action, keeping your cheek on the stock. You shoot at the widest part of their bodies. Look at the center of mass." She nodded. Her jaw was clamped so tight the muscles twitched. She looked terrified, but her hands holding the rifle were steady. "I'll be across the gap." I pointed to a ledge 30 yards away, higher up. "I'll initiate. Don't fire until they try to push forward or retreat. Let the walls trap them." I hesitated. I wanted to say something profound to erase the cold terror in her grey eyes. But I was just a tired old man holding a rifle asking a girl who should have been picking wildflowers to commit murder in the mud. "If I fall," I said harshly, "you don't come down for me. You leave the rifle run for the high timber and don't stop until you reach the mining camp." Cora didn't argue. She didn't cry. She reached out her dirty, calloused hand, gripping the front of my heavy coat, and pulled me down an inch. She kissed me a hard, desperate press of chapped lips. "Just don't fall," she whispered. I turned away, my chest tight, and began the brutal climb to my ledge. The waiting was the worst part. The cold seeped through the soles of my boots, settling deep into my bad knee. I lay flat on the damp rock, the heavy sharps resting on a folded piece of canvas. I checked the breech. Loaded. I slowed my breathing, letting my heart rate drop until I could feel the pulse ticking steadily in my throat. The sun breached the horizon, painting the snow-capped peaks in a deceptive, brilliant gold. 2 hours passed. Then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of a horseshoe striking loose rock. A low voice cursing. The clink of a spur. They were coming. I shifted my eye to the rear Tang's sight. Shadows moved in the mouth of the chimney. First came 2 men on foot, leading their horses. Behind them rode 3 more, forced to dismount as the walls closed in. At the rear, shouting orders, was a man I recognized instantly. Hayes. He wore a tailored wool coat that had no business in the high country, and a scowl that spoke of a man used to buying his way out of inconvenience. He hadn't come for justice. He had come for his property. "Keep moving." Hayes's voice echoed off the rock walls. "The kid said the trail widens out past these rocks. Move those damn animals." They were bunched up. 7 men squeezed into a corridor barely 10 feet wide. I took a breath, letting half of it out, and settled the crosshairs on the lead horse. I didn't want to kill the animal, but a dead horse in the front of the column would create a wall of meat and panic. I squeezed the trigger. The boom of the .50-90 sharps was deafening, a physical shockwave slapping the rock face. The lead horse dropped instantly, screaming, pinning its rider against the granite wall. Chaos erupted. The remaining horses thrashed in the confined space. Men shouted in terror, diving for the scant cover of the rock walls. Before the echo of my first shot died, the distinctive flat crack of Cora's Winchester rang out from across the gap. One of the men scrambling back towards the entrance pitched forward, a blossom of red exploding on his canvas duster. He hit the shale and didn't move. She had hit him dead center. I cracked the breech of the sharps, slid another cartridge in, locked it, and fired into the mass of panicked men. The stone wall behind them exploded, showering them in razor-sharp shrapnel. "Return fire!" Hayes roared, drawing a silver-plated revolver and firing blindly toward my ledge. The bullet chipped the rock 3 feet below me, spraying rock dust into my eyes. 4 rifles opened up, chewing the rock face around my position. Lead whined and snapped overhead like angry hornets. From her boulder, Cora fired again. Then again. She was pacing her shots, forcing the men to keep their heads down, pinning them perfectly between our crossfire. "Pick up your gun, you coward!" Hayes bellowed, shoving his way forward, using his own men as shields. He was looking up, scanning the rocks, his face twisted in a mask of pure rage. He spotted the smoke rising from Cora's position. "There!" Hayes pointed his revolver. "Concentrate fire on those boulders, flush them out." 2 of the men shifted their rifles. A volley of bullets hammered her parapet. Pieces of stone shattered. I saw her duck hard, disappearing from view. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in my chest. I swung the heavy barrel of the sharps toward Hayes, but a valley man stepped in front of him, firing a Winchester from the hip. I felt the impact before I heard the shot. It was like being hit in the ribs with a sledgehammer. The force picked me up and slammed me backward onto the hard rock. The breath was punched from my lungs, my vision fractured into white stars. My left side burned with an agonizing white-hot fire. I reached a trembling hand down to my side. It came back slick and wet with hot blood. "Get up!" my mind screamed. "Get up or she dies!" I rolled onto my stomach, gritting my teeth against a groan that tasted like copper, and dragged myself back to the edge. Down in the chimney, Hayes was advancing. He had realized the heavy rifle had stopped firing. He pushed past his bleeding men, his silver gun raised, moving towards the rocks where Cora was pinned. "Is that you up there, little bird?" Hayes taunted, his voice echoing cruelly. "You think you can hide from me?" He was 10 yards from her boulders. My hands shook violently as I tried to pull the hammer back on the sharps. My left arm was completely dead. The heavy gun slipped clattering loudly against the rock. Hayes stopped, his head snapping toward my ledge. He grinned, a nasty, feral expression. "Ah, the mountain man." He raised his revolver, aiming directly at my exposed head. I couldn't move. I just watched the black bore of his gun, waiting for the flash. A loud metallic clack echoed through the canyon. Hayes froze. Cora had stood up. She wasn't hiding behind the rocks anymore. She was standing fully exposed on top of the boulder, her hair whipped by the wind, her face streaked with dirt and gunpowder. She had the Winchester tucked tight into her shoulder. The hammer was back. Hayes laughed, a dry, barking sound. "Put the gun down, girl. You don't have the stomach for—" Cora didn't let him finish. She pulled the trigger. The heavy bullet caught Hayes directly in the chest. His silver revolver fired harmlessly into the sky as the impact threw him backward. He hit the muddy ground of the game trail hard, his expensive wool coat instantly soaking up the mud and blood. He twitched once and lay still. The silence that followed was absolute. The remaining valley men looked at Hayes's body, then up at the fierce, dirty woman standing on the rocks with a smoking rifle. They didn't say a word. They dropped their guns, grabbed the reins of the surviving horses, and began scrambling frantically backward, fleeing down the mountain trail. I watched them go, my vision tunneling to a small, dark circle. The pain in my ribs was a roaring fire. I let my head drop onto the cold stone, the world fading into a soft, numb grey. The last thing I heard was the sound of boots scrambling desperately over loose shale coming toward me. Jed! A hand touched my face. It was warm. I blinked, trying to clear the heavy fog from my eyes. Cora was kneeling over me. Her face was pale, her grey eyes wide and frantic. She had torn her apron into strips. Her hands were covered in blood. My blood. Stay with me. She ordered, her voice trembling slightly. She pressed a thick wad of cloth hard against my side. I hissed through my teeth, the pain flaring like a struck match. Don't! I gasped. Don't press so damn hard. You're bleeding out, you stubborn old mule. She fired back, her voice cracking. Tears were cutting clean tracks through the gunpowder residue on her cheeks. You don't get to die. Not after this. Not today. I forced a weak, grim smile. Missed the lung. Hit the meat. It hurt to speak. Bullet went clean through. She leaned closer, inspecting the exit wound near my back. She let out a shaky breath, slumping slightly in relief. It's an outside tear. You lost a lot of blood, but it didn't hit the bone. She worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady now that the shooting had stopped. She wrapped the torn apron tightly around my chest, knotting it with brutal efficiency. Every movement sent a fresh wave of agony radiating through my torso, but I didn't make a sound. I watched her. I watched the way her jaw set, the way she wiped her bloody hands on her canvas trousers without hesitation. She had taken a life today. She had stood on a rock and shot a man dead to save me. The soft, trapped valley girl who had frozen in the snow was gone. The mountain had burned her away, leaving behind iron and grit. Help me up, I grunted, extending my right hand. You should lie flat. She protested. I ain't dying on this rock. I growled softly. Get me up. She positioned herself under my right arm, bracing her feet against the shale, and hoisted. I pushed with my good leg, biting down on a scream as the torn muscle in my side stretched. We managed to get me upright. I leaned heavily against her, my arm draped over her shoulders. She smelled like cordite sweat and pine. It was the best thing I had ever smelled. We looked down into the chimney. Haze lay in the mud, staring blankly at the bruised sky. The other bodies were scattered like broken dolls. The valley men wouldn't come back. Without Hayes's money and his brutal threats driving them, they wouldn't risk their lives for a patch of useless rock. The threat was broken. He's dead, Cora said quietly, staring at the man who had tormented her. There was no triumph in her voice, just a hollow, heavy exhaustion. The mountain took him. I said, my voice rough. Leave him to the scavengers. The walk back to the cabin was a brutal blur of pain and slipping boots. It took us 3 times as long as the hike down. By the time the dark logs of the cabin came into view, the sky had broken open. It wasn't a blizzard. It was rain. A heavy, freezing spring downpour that turned the remaining snow into slush and washed the dirt from the trees. It hit us in sheets, soaking us to the bone. We stumbled through the heavy oak door. I collapsed onto the mattress by the stove. I couldn't move. I just lay there, shivering uncontrollably, listening to the rain hammer the wooden shingles above. Cora didn't stop. She stripped off her wet coat, shoved an armful of dry kindling into the stove, and got the fire roaring. She heated water, washed the blood from her hands, and brought a tin cup of hot, heavily sugared tea to my lips. Drink? She ordered gently. I drank. The heat spread through my chest, chasing away the worst of the cold. She sat on the edge of the mattress, running a wet rag over my face, wiping away the rock dust and sweat. Her fingers brushed the long, jagged scar on my cheek, the one she had touched weeks ago. We were quiet for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the relentless drumming of the rain. The cabin felt different now. The tension of the long winter, the fear of the thaw, the looming shadow of haze, it was all gone, washed away by blood and meltwater. I shot a man. She whispered to the dark room, her hand resting on my chest, right over my heart. You saved a life. I corrected her, my hand covering hers. Mine. She looked down at me, her grey eyes soft and exhausted. Are you going to make me go to the mining town now? No. I said the word coming out firm despite the pain in my chest. You belong here, if you want to stay. A small, genuine smile broke across her face. It reached her eyes, lighting up the dark corners of the cabin. She leaned down, resting her forehead gently against my shoulder, uncareful of the bandages. I'm staying, she murmured. It took a month for the hole in my side to close into an angry, puckered scar. By late May, the valley below was fully green, but up here the air was still crisp. The snowpack was gone, replaced by fields of tough alpine grass and the bright, violent purple of wild lupine pushing through the rocky soil. The mountain didn't care about what had happened at the Devil's Chimney. The earth had swallowed the blood, the wolves had cleaned the bones, and the spring growth covered the rest. Nature is a ruthless housekeeper. I was sitting on the front porch, a hand-rolled cigarette clamped between my teeth, oiling the action of the Sharps rifle. My chest ached when the weather turned damp, and my knee was worse than ever, but my hands were steady. The door opened behind me. Cora stepped out carrying a basket of wet laundry. She had altered one of my old flannel shirts to fit her properly, the sleeves rolled up to reveal strong, tanned forearms. The hollows in her cheeks were gone entirely. She looked vibrant, deeply rooted in the harsh, beautiful landscape. She hung the wet clothes on a line stretched between two pine trees, the wind snapping the heavy canvas. I watched her, feeling a quiet, profound peace settling in my chest. I had spent 2 decades believing that isolation was the only way to protect myself from the ugliness of the world. I had built a fortress of ice and silence, convinced that if I let anyone in, they would destroy it. But Cora hadn't destroyed my life. She had anchored it. She finished hanging the clothes and walked over to the porch, wiping her hands on her trousers. She leaned against the railing, looking out over the vast, timbered drop toward the valley. The deer tracks are heavy near the creek, she said, squinting into the sun. We should set a blind this week. We need to start smoking meat before the heat comes. I smiled around the cigarette. You giving orders now, Mrs. Boone? We hadn't found a preacher. We hadn't signed any papers. Up here you didn't need the state's permission to belong to someone. We had spoken our vows in the quiet dark of the cabin with no witness but the fire in the stove. She turned to look at me, a spark of defiance dancing in her grey eyes. Someone has to. If I leave it to you, we'll be eating stale beans until September. She walked over and sat down beside me on the rough wooden steps. She reached out, taking the oiled rag from my hand, and began to wipe down the barrel of the rifle. You're a menace, I grumbled, leaning my head back against the log wall. And you're a grumpy old bear, she replied, not looking up from her work. I looked at the brutal, jagged scar running down the side of my neck. I looked at my calloused, battered hands. I was still 58 years old. I still smelled like wood smoke and leather. The world hadn't miraculously turned soft. But as Cora leaned against my shoulder, her warmth seeping through the flannel shirt, I realized something. I had spent my life apologizing for my scars, hiding them away from a world that demanded perfection. Cora didn't ignore my scars. She loved them, because they meant I had survived long enough to find her. I'm too old for you, Cora, I said softly, a familiar teasing rhythm in my voice. She finished wiping down the rifle, set the rag aside, and turned to face me. She reached up her fingers, tracing the rough skin of my cheek, her eyes fierce and clear, and full of a love that was harder and truer than anything down in the valley. I said, she whispered, a smile playing on her lips, to me you're perfect. And as the spring wind blew through the high timber, carrying the scent of pine and wild lupine, I finally stopped arguing and pulled my wife close. And that is where Jed and Cora's story settles into the mountain, a brutal winter thaw, leading to a hard-won, fiercely loyal life. If this gritty, grounded take on Wild West romance kept you hooked, hit that like button to let me know. It costs nothing and helps the channel bring you more stories with heart, gunpowder, and true survival. Don't forget to share this video with someone who appreciates a real, emotional Western. And subscribe with notifications turned on so you never miss our next wilderness epic. Until next time, keep your powder dry.